Welcome back to Spoke and Spanner. This time we're going to be rebuilding the front end. The first part of this video is the rebuilding of the fork damper rods and insertion into the stanchions. It sounds easy, but when you receive the wrong tool and dodgy piston rings and are constantly told they're right as supplied, you just end up with confusion until, that is, you go your own way. Inside the fork tube or stanchion is a damper rod and a valve with piston rings that have necessary play to slide freely inside the fork tube. The damper rod is fixed to a fork leg or slider, and that slides on the outside of the fork tube with a fork seal to keep in the oil, and that provides free play or clearance. In our BMW, the fork damper valve is sealed to the slider or fork leg by 3 small piston rings, just like in an engine. Those piston rings need end play. That allows them to resist the pressure of oil in the tube, but at the same time allow free sliding without that pesky stiction. Dwayne's BMW website suggests that the best results are obtained by reusing the old rings. I think this is down to the fact that the factory fitted rings have masses of end play, and that can lead to fork chatter. The old rings I removed are on the left and have a gap of 6mm when out of the stanchion. The replacements on the right come with a gap of just 3mm, and they have no end play at all when inserted into the bore. I'm going to show you how to go about setting them up correctly, and once gapped in the right way, you can actually get great performance and quiet operation, as we'll see.
So having sorted out the fork stanchions, I'm turning my attention to the fork legs that have got a rather nasty black goo oozing from them, so they need sorting out. We need to take this bottom nut off in a moment. First I want to take out the old fork seal. So I've just wrapped some rubber tubing around, because I don't have a rubber tipped vise. I've just wrapped some rubber tubing around the fork stanchion to hold it in place in the vise. And then I'm going to take the fork seal out. I'm just leaving it out with a large screwdriver, but being very careful to stay within the seal and not to damage the aluminium at all. There we go, and that's the old sort of vulcanized fork seal there. So now I'm going to turn that fork leg over. There you can see I've removed the seal. I'm going to take this tape off, turn the fork leg over, and I'm going to wrap my rubber around. I think there's a bit of Hylamar sealant in there along with a crush washer. Right, to remove this, I've got a 36mm socket, but you'll see I've had, they normally have a shoulder on them. So I've taken this to an engineering shop and just had it skimmed and smooth. And that gives me, because these nuts are quite, you'll see they've got quite a low height on them. And so by removing that shoulder, I certainly recommend if you're doing any of these jobs, you have that done for yourself. It doesn't cost a lot of money and the socket remains completely usable. It just gives you better purchase on the nut. There we go. Just did the trick. And there's nasty gunks blotching out the bottom. And what you can see inside there is the remains of the rubber bottom bump stop, which, as you can see, has just decayed into a nasty, rigid, blobby gunk, and that's infected the whole of the fork tube, along with the fact that some moisture had got in there and that had caused some rust on the fork springs. And the combination of the two, and you've got the situation that we've got here. So the next stage is to remove this from the vise, and we've got to clean out all that nasty sludge that's in the bottom, if you can see there. And then they'll be ready to once they're cleaned up, they'll be ready for reassembly. And definitely a new bump stop rubber. If I show you what state that actually is in, you see it's just turned into like a dissolved gritty powder. So this is a messy job by any standard, but I just wanted to show you the state of that seal. So this is the one from the other fork leg, and you can see that's the original white rubber seal. I think the new one's a nylon. I'll just show you inside the one that we've got here. Just going to dig it out. So there's a compression washer on the bottom of the fork. There also is a smear of what looks like blue Hylamar to make sure it's properly sealed. Again, inside the fork you can see that dreadful sludge. And it's interesting because I've had a look at the springs, and you can see a combination of that sludge. I've tried to give this one a clean up, but there is a slight kink in it, which I think is when it had seized in the bottom of the fork. But also you can see they've got surface rust on really, and they've also been binding against the side of the fork leg. So on balance, this inside the stanchion, but on balance, replacement is the answer, because a new set of standard springs is only about £20. I have considered putting in progressive springs, and I'll talk a bit more about that in the video. And then for the inside of the tubes, I've acquired this tube brush, which is I think a 42mm diameter for a 38mm fork stanchion. So I'm going to use some spray gunk cleaner. So you get the idea there. So I'll join you again once we've got this work done. We move on to reassembling the necessarily complex set of forks that come with this bike. They were simplified in later models, but one of the benefits of the system as we go through this is that the fork damper piston has characteristics in the design that make it function and operate largely like a fork cartridge. So it does have superior damping properties, but it does mean we have this huge array of components that go back into it. And just for comparison, I haven't cleaned up the second one, so you can see the absolute state that the fork pistons were in, largely as a result of corrosion and degradation of the seals, because there are 3 seals in this piston that I'll take you through in a moment. But just to give you an idea of what goes into this, so we've got the piston damper rod and its cap that is put inside our beautifully re-hard chromed stanchions. To rebuild this damper, we have a set of piston rings that fit around, 3 of them fit around the cap. We then have one of the first damper rubber, a spacer, and an upper spring. Then we have our second top damper. We have our little sandwich that holds the piston rod inside the stanchion, and this is a sandwich made up of 2 threaded caps with another aluminium spacer in the middle. That's all held in place inside the stanchion with these clips, circlips. Then within the lower end of the damper rod itself, and this is where it acts a bit like a cartridge, it's got a ball bearing and a very fine lower hairspring. And then we've got a new unit to threaded cap to go on at the bottom. The reason for that is because it was seized in place and I rounded off the nut, so that's going to go on there with a little bit of Loctite. Then once we've done that, there's a crush washer that goes over that inside the cap at the bottom of the fork leg. And then this is the bottom fork cap with a copper crush washer, and the lower damper fits inside there. Now I've seen some videos where this has been put in the wrong way around. It doesn't want to go in that way, and it goes in with the flat surface up because that will bear against the bottom of the piston rod. And then finally we have the shock nut and wave washer that retains the whole thing together. That's what you also remove in order to drain the fork. So like I say, we've got a nicely newly hard chromed stanchions, and I've cleaned up the fork lower legs. And in order to fit the damper with its lightweight piston rings into that, a fine thread inside the stanchion, and this BMW tool. Right, and what that lets you do is insert, it compresses, it's got a chamfer inside, and it compresses the piston rings before they go into the stanchion. And then finally, due to the condition of the existing springs and following the comments that I received when I put a survey onto Facebook, we've got new standard progressive springs. These aren't Hyper Pro, they're the standard progressives that should give us better response on the shocks. We're now going to assemble the first damper rod, and we are going to be using the fork fluid, which is the recommended Aeroshell 4 telescopic fork oil. This is a BMW recommended liquid. There's probably as many different views as to what you should put in your shocks as hot dinners, but we're going to use the recommended fluid to lubricate as we put the different components back together. So the first thing I'm going to do is just reassemble the upper damper, and onto that is there's a pair of everything here, because obviously I've got to redo this rather dirty rod. It's got to be cleaned up and done. So we've got one of these little damper washers. We've got the spacer that we've cleaned up, and we want one of the two upper damper springs. All of these components have had to be replaced due to the condition of the shock. So the spring goes on first. There we go, that sits beautifully on there. Then we've got the aluminium spacer and our, I'm going to say rubber, it feels like some sort of plastic washer. We're going to put a drop of Loctite. Give this shape. This is Loctite 270 I'm using here. I'm not putting much on there at all. And then I'm going to screw our upper damper rod cap onto there. Now these don't need to be tightened up significantly, but what I found out taking them apart is that the best way to do that is to put a drift through the fluid holes just to hold it in place, and then just to tighten that up with a socket. So we'll do that just to make sure it's got some tightness. Tightening that up, I'm using a 3/16 or 4.8mm drift, just pop through the holes, the lower damper rod holes, just to hold it in place. And then I've got a 13mm socket, and then I can use this just to tighten that up, and that is quite sufficient. Right, before I put the piston rings on, ready to insert it into the stanchion, I'm going to deal with this bottom end in the same way. So in here we have a new I've purchased, because the others have just turned completely black, partly through my heating it to get the thing apart and partly through corrosion. So we've got a lovely shiny new ball bearing and one of these hairsprings, and all of what these do is open and close different damper holes. I'm going to pop the spring in the seat of the base. First I'm going to pop a bit of my Loctite on there. I'm really not using much, I don't think it's necessary. Okay, so I've got my spring in there. I'm going to drop my ball bearing down into the housing. Oh, this is going to be fun. Then you'll see if you've got, I don't know whether you can see this or not, you'll see if you've got it right. The ball bearing sitting on top of the spring, hopefully you can see that. I'm happy with that. And then again, I'm just going to hold the whole assemblage and tighten it up. So the next stage is just to put our 3 little piston rings, and being 360 degrees around the circumference, we want to position the gaps in the piston rings at 120 degrees apart. Here's an interesting conundrum. So this is a special tool to compress those piston rings. So as you put it in, and I'm putting it this way for a reason, just to show you, then it'll pass through there and the chamfer will compress those rings. So I've widely read that you should insert the damper rod like this and not from the top of the stanchion down through. Now, when we came to do the installation now, and we get our BMW special tool, we find that the thread on the BMW tool is coarse, not fine, and it only corresponds to the top of the stanchion, like that. This means that essentially you have to pass the damper rod down through the stanchion and push it through to come out of the bottom. So that is what we're going to do, but I don't know why those websites say on the contrary, but we're going to go with it. I'm now going to get some of the forecoil and wipe it around the interface there. So here goes. So we've got our unit in place. I'm going to drop. I actually wonder if we've actually got the right tool there. It doesn't seem to be of sufficient width to permit the metal collar to pass through. So far, the most inexplicable thing is this tool. that is supposed to assist you with inserting the damper rod into the fork stanchion, and it's got a taper there which is supposed to compress the piston rings on the damper. But I've taken the piston rings off the damper here, and you'll see that even without the piston rings, that damper will not pass through the bore of the tool. The second problem relates to the threads. So you can see that this tool has a coarse thread, and if we zoom in, you'll see that the bottom of the damper rod has a fine thread. So just putting those side by side. Now there is a coarse thread in the top of the stanchion, but all of the manuals are very clear that you shouldn't pass the damper rod down through the complete bore of the stanchion. You should insert it effectively. If you have this tool, the tool should fit in here with a fine thread. You can see it's actually smaller than the thread at this end, and that's probably why the bore's so fine. There's not enough material to widen it out, but you put that in there, and you're supposed to be able to pass the damper rod through, and that would come down through the tool. The damper rod without the piston rings would not pass through the tool, so clearly there's a problem there. The supplier absolutely is adamant that it's the right tool, and even suggests I was putting it in the wrong end. I wasn't. So we've had to send that back. Also, as a result of that mess up with the tool, we bent the first lot of piston rings. Now, part of the reason for that is because, as I've said before, there was no end play on the piston rings. In fact, when you inserted the piston rings into the bore and just squared them up with the damper rod, you actually found that the tips, the ends of the piston ring, overlap slightly, and so they're never going to work. Again, the supplier said to me, we've sold thousands of those piston rings, no one's ever said anything about gapping them, and you shouldn't need to. Well, thank you very much. It doesn't work. So the answer has to be to re-gap those piston rings. By way of comparison, these are the two piston rings. So on the right is the old piston ring. You can now see the difference in the gap is enormous. I only kept one set of the old piston rings, the others were too bad. Now this set probably would clean up. The new piston rings will insert into the bore on the piston, but we're going to check the end play in a moment. But I think they're so tight up against each other, the damper was completely stiff in the bore. What I'm doing now is measuring the end play. So in the bore here, I have inserted one of the old piston rings. What I'm going to do is measure the end play on both types of piston ring. In the bore at the moment, I have inserted one of the original piston rings. I'm now going to zoom in, and you'll see that the free play is significant, and I've got a set of feeler gauges here, but it's that big that I'm going to need most of the feeler gauges, so I think it's way too big. It's taking the entire set of feeler gauges there, which is quite extraordinary. So I'm just going to pop that out. I'd say the existing piston rings have far too much end play. Now I know on a damper in a suspension unit in a fork, probably not that critical, particularly with 3 rings. But if they do end up all aligning, which can happen when the fork's compressing and expanding, then it's quite possible that you'll get airflow past the rings, oil flow past the rings. I'm now inserting the newly supplied rings. We'll just square them up with the damper rod. The 2 ends of the damper ring are butted up, and in fact you can't even get them square in the bore, because effectively what's happening is that the 2 ends of the piston ring are starting to overlap when you're trying to put them in. So therein lies our problem as to why when they're on the damper it's not actually possible, and now it's got stuck, it's not actually possible to pass the damper up and down the bore. The solution to this problem is that we need to increase the end play. Now there's no criteria to my knowledge on what the end play should be, and I'd say it's somewhere between the gap we've got here and probably not as big as the gap we've got on the original rings. Now the forks do get warm in operation, but they don't get up to temperatures which would be equivalent to a piston in an engine, of course. So the degree of expansion and contraction of metals will be a lot less, which would suggest that the clearances can be tighter. So in all other respects, these rings are fine. They just need the end play opening up, and to do that we need to use a end grinding tool, and that's going to be the next stage. And so I'm going to go not quite as big as the existing rings and then match them up on both sides. The next dilemma is how much end play to allow. Now the guide for petrol engines is 0.04 inches or 0.1 millimeters of end play for each 25 millimeters of bore circumference. Now the diameter of our bores in the fork legs is 36 millimeters, so 0.45 millimeters of end play. Now I also want to have regard though to the fact that the piston rings we took out have a massive amount of end play in there. You can fit an entire set of feeler gauges in the gap when it's in the bore, so I'm not keen on that. So what do we do instead? Well, I think 0.45 is a little tight, just intuitively, because what I want is good oil control, definitely no stiction in those fork tubes, but I also want to eliminate any possibility of chatter. Now these fork legs are prone to having something of a reputation of a bit of noise, and that's probably mostly due to the springs, but I also think it could be in part due to those piston rings, just a theory. So I've landed on a perhaps random gap of 0.63 millimeters for the end play on our stanchion damper pistons. Conveniently, I have a feeler gauge of 0.63 millimeters. So I'm going to gently grind each piston ring out until I reach, and you have to creep up on this. So you do a little bit, insert it into the bore, square it up with the damper rod in the bore, and then take a reading. Once we've done that, we've got to find a way to get the damper rod with its 3 piston rings in situ inside the bore. Now, I think it is quite realistic to do that with a small screwdriver, which is what Haynes recommend, but also on one of the websites, and you'll see I've started to butcher a Coke can, and they're made of such thin aluminium now you can just cut them with a pair of kitchen scissors. But that, some say, will make an ideal kind of conical funnel to compress the piston rings and protect them from the bore lip. It's not so much the threads as the lip inside the bore there that we're trying to avoid. So we'll have a look at doing that as well and see how practical that is. If it works, if it doesn't, I shall go back to my technique with my little screwdriver. So over to the grinding machine, and we'll cut a piston ring, measure it up, and then hopefully we should be in a position to move forward with our reassembly. This is our piston ring grinder, purchased through a very well-known auction website. It's not bad. It's got a good diamond disc. It's got a little bit of side-to-side end play in the mechanism. Doesn't really matter too much for what we want to do. And it's designed so on a piston ring from an engine, you'd put the piston ring around this turret here, and then you'd hold it and spin it against it. Now our piston rings are minute, and they're too small obviously to go in, so the way I'm doing this is I'm cutting the right hand side as I look at it, and I'm pushing it up against the turret, and then I'm holding it, and I've got the one side held away, and I'm holding this side against the disc. Hopefully you can hear.
Why does it hit me the hardest when I'm off my game, when I'm feeling strange already?
And you should be able to see the bright edge, there we go, of that piston ring compared to the other side where it started to grind it down. I've already adjusted one, so as a check I can just see how I'm getting there with the new ones. A little bit more to do on that. I'm also making sure that when I grind it, because there is a bit of variability in that grinder, that I'm getting a square edge, and then at the end we're going to use a little engineering file to make sure there's no fascias. I'm hoping you can see that at the moment there's no gap there at all. If I can get the light right, I think you can just about see that. And actually there's no clearance yet, but I have got rid of the overlapping. There's some more grinding to do. When we're starting, you can see we're just starting. You get a little bit of clearance in there of a millimetre. I don't want to measure it at this stage with another feeler gauge because I'm just trying to creep up. This is what they mean by creeping up on the gap, is that you progressively do small amounts of grinding until you reach that position with the gap. A little too narrow at the moment. And there we have it, 0.63. Now, having got to the point of achieving the gap we're after, the next job is to use a small, very fine engineering file so that's all 3 oil control rings now completed. I've got 3 adjusted rings plus the damper rod, and we're going to have a go at cutting up our Coke can and we'll see what that does. And let it expand. Now the thing is, I can see that there's still quite a lip. I think what we need is another Coke can and double up the thickness. I'm just going to wash off and blow dry our damper rod just to make sure there's no dust or anything on there. Check everything works fine, which it does. For lubrication, I'm going to use some 10 grade standard fork oil, slightly thicker than the BMW stuff we're going to put into the BMW recommended oil. We're going to put in the stanchions, but it's a bit more lubricosity, slipperier. Then we're going to put our 3 piston rings on. I'm going to put each gap 110 degrees roughly from each other. Although in reality, just like a car, I believe that in use the piston rings can rotate and at times will be in the same orientation as each other, leaving you with all the gaps coinciding, but I'm told that doesn't matter. There's nothing you can do about it. It is what it is. And I'm also going to put inside our Coke can, make sure that's lubricated. Now here we go. After a bit of jiggery pokery, my workbench is looking a bit messy now. But I can report that the Coke can method is effective Now you probably need a new one for each stanchion, lots of oil on it, and I put it in a long spiral like that, where this end is just below the lip inside the tube, and then you can kind of push down on the fork damper at the same time that you pull out with the Coke can. It seems to drop it in, and so now I've increased the end play gap to 1 millimeter, and that's given me, with some oil in there, a beautifully smooth damping action. Once the stanchion's inside and moving freely, and you've established that you've got all of your Coke can back, you can see they tend to tear, but it got through that all right. Then we've got to lubricate and insert a damper bush, which goes over like that. So you insert your damper bush, and then I just use a drift to get that to fit in the tube. It'll position itself. I just need it low enough it's not going to foul those threaded pieces. There we go. Hopefully you can see that. And then we're on to our threaded rings. Drop that in the top. We're going to lower the piston rod down and then use our circlip pliers and get that on the right thread. There we go. And I'm just literally spinning the damper to screw that, spinning the stanchion to screw that down into the bottom once it's seated. Just make sure it's tight. And we pop in our spacer ring. Then finally we fit our circlip in. So we've got an internal set of circlip pliers here, so just pop that like that. Get your circlip pliers and then once it's in, you can just rotate it in the groove by pinching it together with your circlip pliers. There we go. So there we have our second rebuilt damper. And we can see what a nice free movement we've got there. So they're both ready now to put back on the bike.
Well, there you have it. Our stanchions took far longer than I imagined to rebuild correctly. And so that pushes our final front end rebuild and avoidance of stiction into our next video. As you can see, Sally is pooped, and so as we're at Motorcycle Live this week, I thought you'd enjoy seeing the new BMW GS 1300 and F900 Cup Edition with a fantastically loud Arrow exhaust in the hands of the professionals. Here you go. make him ride over the top of it. Oh no! No, he's gonna put it. No, he's gonna go over him.
If you enjoyed this video and want to see the next episode, please like and subscribe below. Catch you next time.